Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our third of 4 sessions on the question of democracy and governance, one of the code red issues of our time. The theme for today is, will we wake up in time? And given world conditions, that's probably the most salient question that we humans can be asking ourselves for all kinds of reasons. And in that spirit, I thought it would be good to start today with a momentous announcement that came from the Vatican just a few hours ago, indicating that after 5 centuries, the Vatican is waking up to a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery that was enunciated as a papal bull, Inter Caetera, by Pope Alexander VI, one of the Borgia popes. If you know your Italian history, one of the most corrupt periods of the last 2,000 years of the papacy, as the papacy was bought and sold to the highest bidder, and the Borgia family in Italy had a succession of popes and cardinals having enough wealth to buy the papal throne. And Alexander the Sixth, as he was called, who came into the papacy in 1492, in 1493 issued the papal bull that basically divided the Western Hemisphere south of North America between the Portuguese and the Spanish, enunciated the doctrine that the Europeans generally, both in the Western Hemisphere but also in Africa, were free to colonize, to enslave, and essentially to do whatever they deemed necessary to establish colonial empires and to extract wealth by whatever means from the native populations. And as you probably all well know, in the 100 years following the landing of Christopher Columbus in Santo Domingo in October of 1492, 100 million indigenous peoples that were alive during that time, and subsequently 90% of the indigenous populations were wiped out by the policies legitimated by that papal bull. This is particularly important to the United States and this question of democracy, which is one of the reasons why I am raising it today, because it was in 1823 that the US Supreme Court codified the papal bull into US federal law by denying the Indian tribes that were petitioning the court for the right to have sovereignty over their land. The court ruled that was in contradiction to that papal bull that gave the right of the Europeans to seize the land and to legalize a colonial possession. And in fact, it was the Supreme Court in 1823 that coined the term doctrine of discovery. And that has been maintained in US law ever since, most recently by the Supreme Court in 2005, when the Oneida Nation in New York, after 200 years of oppression, got enough money together and bought some of their ancestral land. And they said, we're repossessing this land. It was our land from the beginning, using the same logic as the Jews did in the repossession of Israel in the 20th century. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it was no one less than Ruth Bader Ginsburg that wrote the majority opinion saying you have the right to buy the land, but you have no sovereignty over the land because of the doctrine of discovery. That in fact, the US federal government is the supreme arbiter, and therefore you may have legal possession, but federal laws, state laws of the United States have jurisdiction. You have to pay taxes, and in effect, you are a landowner like anybody else in the United States. So that gives us a sense of how deeply buried into not only legal jurisprudence, but I would say in the collective psyche of that papal bull, Inter Cateria, by Alexander VI back in 1493. And it's also worth just noting, as we have been reflecting over the last several days about what's going on in Israel with the massive protests against the evisceration of the Israeli Supreme Court and various other matters that have been implemented by the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. I read an article just yesterday saying that, polling shows that most of the people on the streets trying to protect the integrity of the Supreme Court there don't have any real value for the Palestinians. They believe that the Israelis have absolute right to put in as many settlements as they want into the West Bank. Most of them don't believe in the right of the Palestinians to establish a separate state. Most of them don't have any sense about the Arab Israelis that constitute over 20% of the Israeli population of over 9 million, should be anything other than second-class citizens. So this also raises this question that Israel's grappling with, the United States is grappling with, and most countries as to what is the nature of the franchise. Is it just white males over the age of 25 who own property, which was the constraint back in the Revolutionary War period? Those were the only people that were allowed to vote in the American democracy that we fought a Revolutionary War to obtain. Black people were excluded, women were excluded. And over the last 250 years, there's been one fight after another as to who actually is included when you talk about democracy. It's a fundamental question that is yet to be resolved anywhere. There's no country on earth that gives the franchise to everybody. It's extraordinary. And one of the battles here in the United States is that one of the major parties is seeking actively, officially, and with determination to limit the franchise. So when we talk about democracy and we talk about what is it going to take to wake us up, one of the fundamental questions is, who gets to vote? And how do we expand this notion of democracy till finally it includes everybody as human beings? And I would argue, although that's not really on the table, it should include all sentient beings. There should be an essential respect for all sentient beings, and in fact, the Earth ecology as part of honoring life on Earth. And I raise this because when we talk about democracy, we often think about fixing something here or there, but in reality, it's a very deep existential issue of human inclusion. And the announcement today by the Vatican that they're repudiating, but they're not apologizing for the doctrine of discovery is both a step forward in a very fundamental way, but it is also an indictment against the Vatican and for us all, indicating how far we still need to go to make democracy and governance a true reality on our precious planet. Let us just pause before we dive into our session today and breathe together as we always do on Humanity Rising. In a moment, for those of you who are new, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in slowly for about 5.5 seconds. You'll hear the sound of another bell. And we're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we will embark on our program. Thank you, everyone. Let us breathe together. Thank you, everyone. It's now my pleasure to introduce my good friend George Cappannelli and Tom Eddington, who have been so instrumental in the development of Humanity Rising toward a Humanity Rising network. George is the founder and CEO of AgeNation. Tom is the founder and CEO of Endangered Global, and both of them are passionate about democracy and nonviolence and the revitalization of the polity, not only in the United States, but globally, as humanity faces issues that have been unprecedented in almost every category of concern. So the responsibilities that we have as humans at this moment to understand and to take the kind of action requisite to ensure our survival could not be more important. And therefore, the question that we're going to be asking today is, will we wake up in time? Is very salient. So George, Tom, thank you for joining. And I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks very much. Just one little point about the indigenous. There's a chance in our Celebrating Life 2023 conference that we're going to include a film called The Five Canes. The tribes of New Mexico received 5 gold canes from leaders around the world acknowledging their sovereignty long before the US had even the likelihood of doing that. So anyway, it was interesting to discover that fact, and this film explores that. Today, as you say, we're going to be covering this question of, are we going to wake up in time? I just want to open with one quick quote by St. Augustine, who said, "He who created us without our help will not save us without our consent," which speaks to this issue of we the people and what we can do and need to do. Tom and I had the privilege of having a conversation we're going to share with you this morning with Stefan Schwartz. And Stefan, as you may know, is a remarkable man, idiosyncratic to say the least. He does a lot of experimentalism with parapsychology, and he's been privileged to participate in a whole series of major social change efforts. And so we're going to spend some time with him today that we recorded that we did before. And then at the end of that, Tom, Jim, and I will come back. Tom, do you have any opening comments you want to make?
No, let's jump right into the interview with Stefan, and then we'll reconvene.
Terrific. Georg, can you roll that, please?
Whoa. What is that?
So, George Cappannelli here, Tom Eddington, for this conversation with Stefan Schwartz. Stefan has an interesting piece on his site. He says, "My life has been spent exploring extraordinary human functioning and how individuals and small groups can and have affected social change. I've done this both as an experimentalist in parapsychology and by being privileged to have been part of several major social transformations. Civil rights in the 60s, the transformation of the military from an elitist conscription organization to an all-voluntary meritocracy in the 70s, citizen diplomacy between the US and the Soviet Union in the 80s and 90s. Both the experiences and the research have convinced me that all life is interconnected and interdependent. And you'll see that reflected in several sections of my books and research papers on remote viewing and archaeology, anthropology, medicine, healing, creativity, and social policy. In short, Stefan's a troublemaker for a long time. And he has a lot of CDs and DVDs and books. He publishes the Schwartz Report, which has been functioning since 1991. And he's also known for a wonderful book called The 8 Laws of Change. And Stefan's going to be with us, and we're going to take democracy and just tear it apart today. So, Stefan, welcome.
My pleasure.
So, on the democracy dialogues, democracy and governance dialogues now, Stefan, one of the things we often go back to and talk about is the Powell Memorandum in 1972, and how, thanks to Lewis Powell, the conservative Republicans developed a blueprint that they have been functioning on since then. From my standpoint, and I think yours, since you wrote a wonderful article on it, and Tom's as well, Leonard Leo may very well constitute the next serious and most dangerous person in American politics since Lewis Powell. So, let's begin. What do you know about Leonard Leo, and what should our audience know about he and the organization that he's causing trouble, a lot of trouble with, called Teneo, the Teneo network.
Well, Teneo's only a part of it. There's also the Marble Freedom Trust, and there's the Federalist Society. Leonard Leo is a young man who is, in many ways, the most successful Christo-fascist strategist operating in the country today. And he's been backed by Barre Said, who's given him $1.6 billion to operate, because Said is a 90-year-old Chicago businessman who had no children and didn't have anybody he was going to pass his wealth on to. So he gave it to Leonard Leo. And Leo started, of course, with the Federalist Society. They have restructured the Supreme Court. They, from my perspective, the two big things that are going on are, one, we are becoming racially a majority-minority nation, and also a gender equality nation, and that's part of it. And the other thing is the passage of Citizens United, which legalized bribery. And as a result of that, the oligarchs have basically taken over the Republican Party, and they rent these people out as needed, and you get the kind of, the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Matt Getz, the Hawleys, these guys who, first of all, aren't very knowledgeable, and second of all, they're for rent. And so if you look at the way funding comes out of the oligarchy, you see that what they want is less regulation of corporate businesses and lower taxation. And what's happening in the United States is that we are creating a wealth nobility and a compliant peasantry who are not very well educated. That's part of why they're attacking public education. Again, as I've said to you before, I need to be very, very clear where I'm coming from, because I am not interested in political partisanship or philosophy, or I care about those things only anthropologically. What I care about is objectively verifiable social outcome data that measures the success of something. And when you look at that, what you find, and there is no exception that I've been able to find, and I've been looking at this for many years, but if you look at it, social policies which foster well-being are always more effective, more efficient, more productive, easier to implement, longer enduring, and much, much cheaper. So the question that I always ask is, does this foster well-being? If you look at the Leonard Leo thing, you can see what they're doing. They are trying to create the proper word is an anocracy, and they don't like democracy because they are a minority group and increasingly becoming a smaller minority group, and they care about profit and power. And everything in the United States, as a result of Citizens United and what has been done to the Supreme Court, has been crafted to support that. That is the curse of what is happening to the United States.
And many other countries in the world.
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, it's not just happening in the United States, but what is happening in the United States is that one of the parties has been turned into a kind of white supremacy, Christo-fascist, white nationalist, male-dominant, obsessive heterosexual cult.
So with that cult, the demographic genie can't but be put back in the bottle, where, you know, we've seen, and you've talked about the Supreme Court, what is the perceived threat that they're responding to, and what are the tactics and the strategies they're pursuing to overcome that demographic genie?
Well, the first thing is they are trying to get rid of democracy because they don't want a majority vote, because they are a minority. And in fact, if you look at, again, the social outcome data and the academic research on these issues, you see that 18 to 34s are increasingly oriented toward fostering well-being, I think largely because they recognize they are going to be living in the world of climate change, and they recognize better than older people do what climate change is going to do to the United States. I mean, we're going to have 3 major internal migrations, for instance. Millions of people are going to be on the move. It's already starting. So younger people are much more interested in gender equality. The women, young women, are not interested in being controlled by these evangelical Christian groups, and they're this, you know, if the anti-abortion people, if they really cared about people and the well-being, then they would be supporting child care and child mortality, and they don't, because the states that are the worst in anti-choice for women also have the worst infant mortality and maternal mortality. And the other thing that's beginning to happen now, and I've been looking at this particularly in the last few months, is that as a result of the Dobbs decision, the already bad, you know, the United States doesn't really have health care. We have an illness profit system. And the whole thing is really geared toward producing as much profit as possible. What we need, of course, is universal birthright, single-payer health care. People like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren understand that, are working for that. But the maggot group, they don't like democracy. They are completely controlled by corporate oligarchs who, as I say, what they care about is that they stay in power, that their tax rate be very low, and that their capacity to make profit be as large as possible. So the question I think that we're facing is, in the 2024 election, which I consider to be the leverage point election, because if the Republicans take the Senate and the House and the presidency, by 2028 we won't be a democracy anymore, and we will have been completely restructured, because this shrinking group of people, it's about a third of the white people is actually what it gets down to. They want to stay in power. They want their get out of jail free card, and they're going to do anything that they can to make that happen. And the question is, do enough Americans who support democracy and who believe in the fostering of well-being, are they prepared to stand up and be counted? And I don't know the answer to that.
It's interesting, Stefan, because so far my answer is that they're not willing to stand up and to be counted. On some levels, they have shown up in significant numbers in 2018, 20, and 22. But between those elections, it's like, in my opinion, we the people go to sleep. And meanwhile, what's interesting to me is, in this time, between 1972 and 2016, a lot of this motive that you articulate so clearly on the part of the minority was present and hard at work in the shadows, but it did not take center stage. It wasn't as bold and open as it is today. Now there's no hiding the intention of this minority, and still the majority seems numb and quiet at a lot of levels. That's not to say that I don't find an enormous number of really remarkable people working hard to prevent that from happening. But by and large, the population is quiet. We don't respond. We don't protest. We don't spend our money on things that could influence any of that. And I don't know, frankly, what's going to wake us up in time. What do you think?
Well, part of what I think is going to wake us up is climate change, because you can already see look at what's happening in California right now. You look at Florida. I have been telling people for a number of years now that, as I said earlier, we're going to have these 3 migrations away from the coasts because of too much water, away out of the southwest because of lack of water and temperatures that are too high, and out of the central states because of catastrophic weather events like tornadoes. I was a couple of years ago, I was in Oklahoma. I'd been invited to speak at a conference, and they had a dinner afterwards, and they had the county commissioners came to some of them to the dinner, and I was seated next to one of them, and he was a climate denier, I discovered in talking to him. So I said, well, what are you worried about? And he said, well, what's worrying me right now is how many times do you rebuild a town? And I said, I don't understand. And he said, well, we've got a town that's been destroyed twice by tornadoes. And the question is, should we keep rebuilding it? And I said, you don't think of that as climate change? And he said, oh, no, this is just normal weather stuff, it's but the reality is, and you can already see this happening. I've been telling people in Florida, for instance, start watching what the insurance companies are doing, because when they stop insuring coastal properties, you're going to see $1 trillion real estate collapse. And if you look at the best projections that we can get on what's going to happen about sea rise, you can see that from about Fort Myers down, Florida's going to disappear. And the Florida insurance companies are already notifying coastal property owners they won't insure them. So you're going to be left with the question of, do I live here and just take my chances, or I have enough money that I don't care, or do I live here because I don't have any other option and I just wait and see what happens? But we're going to see that, and we're going to see it in California, Los Angeles, Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, San Diego. All of that has got sections that are going to go underwater based on the projections. I mean, a few days ago, the IPCC just put out their latest report, and they basically said humanity either gets with it or we're going to see catastrophic destruction of civilizations. And so the question is, are we going to wake up and do what needs to be done? Are we going to make the conversion, for instance, out of the carbon era? Now, there is good news. In Europe, for instance, many countries and a few states in the United States, California, are committing that they will get all internal combustion engines, internal combustion powered vehicles off their roads by 2040, 2045. That's good news. You look at the countries that are fostering well-being, the Nordic countries, Holland, New Zealand, And you see those countries, first of all, all their social outcome data is better. Their infant mortality is lower, maternal mortality is lower. We've got states like Mississippi and Louisiana, which if they weren't in the United States would be third world countries. And we also, we are going through this great schism, what I call the great schism trend between the red and the blue states. And what doesn't seem to have penetrated through is that the red states can't function without the support of the blue states. For every dollar a red state puts in, they take more than $1 out of the treasury. And the blue states, for every dollar they put in, take less than $1 out. So I think what we're going to see is, because the Senate is at the present time improperly structured, you've got senators who represent what would be neighborhoods in some of the blue states, 200,000 or 300,000 people, 400,000 people, and you've got cities in the millions. It's completely out of whack. So unless we can change the structure of our Congress, I think what's going to happen is that we are going to stay one country, but real power, and this, you see it with Dobbs, you can watch what Dobbs is doing. Real power is going to devolve to the states or groups of states that join together, like California, Oregon, and Washington. I mean, you can already, just if you look at healthcare in the United States, you see, for instance, in Idaho, a hospital, the only hospital in a city of 9,000 people, Sandpoint, Idaho, has announced that they will no longer do obstetrical care. Now that means that if a woman has to deliver, she's got to go someplace else, because in her city, there's no hospital to go to deliver your baby. If you look at what's happening in the medical schools, which are now changing their curriculum because they are concerned about teaching obstetrical care, and you look at the enrollment for medical schools, you see that particularly young women are not going to medical schools in red states, that OBGYNs in red states are leaving, so their health care for women is already poor and is going to get worse. So as we devolve down to state powers, I think what we're going to see is that the blue states are going to prepare for climate change much better than the red states. And so they're going to be able to weather this better. And because of what's happening as a result of things like Dobbs and the other decisions which are coming down, the dismantlement of public education, for instance. I just saw a study that just came out that the IQ of Americans is going down. From 1923 to just a few years ago, it was consistently going up every year. Now it's going down. We've got, in the red states particularly, all kinds of movements to ban books so that children don't read actual history. They don't actually get educated, they get indoctrinated. So you're going to see that trend carrying itself out in the red states. And so you're going to have less and less educated people in red states than in blue states. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in the blue cities in the red states and how they're going to be able to deal with it. But I think that the 24 election is going to be the turning point. If the Democrats continue to hold the White House and take back both the Senate and the House with enough majority to be able to act, I think we have an optimistic future. If the Republicans take over the House and the Senate and the White House, then I think we are becoming an anocracy, and it will be essentially a nation of a wealthy nobility and a compliant peasantry.
So when you talk about that, and I'd like to go back to the minority you were describing a moment ago, the imagery that comes to mind for me when you talk about that minority is a bunch of old white guys smoking cigars, drinking martinis on the deck of the Titanic.
Yes.
Where do they think they can go? How do they think that they can survive? What are they surviving for if they're creating? Are we talking fortress cities, towns, homes?
First of all, I don't think a lot of them think past their own lives. So, I mean, we were talking about Leonard Leo and Barré's side, who gave this guy $1.6 billion to promote essentially programs which are destructive of democracy. So what was he thinking? Does he have any nephews or nieces, or for instance? I don't know. I mean, when you look at the data, you have to ask yourself, what are these people thinking? I mean, I think, Tom, you've got exactly, what are these people thinking? If you look at technological development, we have this violent, nasty anti-immigration activity going on in the United States. How many Americans recognize that of the Fortune 500 companies, 219 of them were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants? How many millions of Americans are working for those 219 corporations, and whose livelihood is entirely based on the innovation and creative business of immigrants? So it isn't clear to me. And when I talk to people who are in that maggot world, they don't make any sense.
Steve,
They talk about I'm being replaced. I say, really? Have you lost your job? Has somebody replaced you? What does that mean? When you ask people, what does woke mean, for instance, they cannot give you an answer. When you ask them, what is replacement about? What's being replaced? They can't give you an answer. I mean, they give you their fantasies, but the answers don't make any sense. When you point that out, they say, "Oh well, yes, but that doesn't matter," or well, you've been brainwashed by libs, or whatever. I don't know. I am, my family has been here since 1609. I have two forebears who were involved with signing the Declaration and the Constitution. I mean, I don't know anything about genetics or genealogy. That's just stuff that I heard when I was a boy. But I do know that, I'm a vet. My dad was a vet. All his brothers were vets. All my mother's brothers were vets. And you go all the way back to George Washington. So I feel an investment in the country in a very deep way. And yet I got to tell you, what is happening in the United States, I find very alarming.
Stephen, I really wish you wouldn't sugarcoat things the way you were doing. No, but I think it's your honesty and your is delightful in a time when truly there are so many people burying their heads in the sand and pretending things are not going on. And what I love about you is that you not only, as you said at the outset, facts are important to you. So you make your decisions based on that. But let's wind back a little bit to some of the critical challenges that you've talked about. I mean, you talk about climate migration, 3 forms of climate migration in the US. So if people are moving away from the coasts because they're disappearing, if they're moving away from the Southwest because of water and drought issues, and they're moving away from the Midwest because of the tornadoes and the significant climate storms, where the hell did they go?
Well, that is one of the issues. I think, George, if you look at this, for instance, let me get it down to a specific example. I was asked to speak at a medical conference, and there's about 400 or 500, 600 doctors in this thing, and I said to them, because I was describing these migrations, I said, if you live in a city of, let's say 9,000 or 10,000 people, and 1,000 people suddenly appeared in your city, where would they go to the bathroom? Where would they sleep? 11 or 12% are diabetics. Where are they going to get insulin? A whole other set need other kinds of medications. We have a lot of people right now who need mental health medications. Where are they going to get that? Are you prepared to deal with that? And these doctors came up to me afterwards and said, we never even thought about that. And no, we are completely unprepared for that. I mean, they'd sleep in, we'd put tents up in the parks. We'd turn the school gymnasiums over to things, and I guess we'd put those little portable toilets out in the parking lots, but no, we're not prepared for that at all. And I said, well, suppose it was 10,000 people who came suddenly because there was some tornado that destroyed their town, or there was a tsunami that hit some coastal area and suddenly people were driven out. What would you do with that? Why aren't we planning for this? If you go back in history, one of the really teaching moments is that after World War I, the disruption to Europe was so catastrophic as a result of World War I that in the 30s, they began to think about, what would we do if this happened again? And they put together what became a United Nations when the United Nations got created. Started before the United Nations, but they put together plans of how to deal with it. And they were, at the end of the Second World War, those plans were all invoked, and because there were millions of people who were wandering around Europe who'd been displaced, and the way they were able to deal with it was because they had done that pre-planning. So what I ask every congressman I have contact with, and every person who's in the city council or county commission, those kind of things, I ask them, what are you doing? Look at what's going to happen to your area in terms of climate change. This is not a secret. You can do a Google on sea rise maps, and it'll show you what the best projections are. So I say to them, what are you doing to plan for this? How are you going to deal with this? What is going to happen when these things occur? And they are occurring. Look at what's going on in the world today. At one point last year, I think it was last year, a third of Pakistan was underwater. Bangladesh is going to largely disappear. What about the islands in the Pacific? What's happening to coastal areas in the United States? Florida, Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia. What are we going to do? Where is the planning? And because you don't see any of that planning. So the question we have is, this is going to happen. The IPCC has made it very clear what's coming. What are we doing to prepare for that? That's the question I think we need to be asking. And by the way, I have an answer. And this is what I tell everybody who I talk to in these kind of interviews. Gandhi gave us the technique. Every day, Well, let me tell the Gandhi story. Gandhi, right before he got assassinated, a reporter from the Times of India came up to interview him at the ashram, and he said, Gandhiji, my editor sent me up here just to ask you one question. And Gandhi said, well, what's the question? And he said, the question is, how did you force the British to leave India? How did you force them to give up their most prized colonial possession? You know, the monarch of England was the queen was the empress. How did you force them to do that and give all this up without a war? And his answer was, and this is, I think, the answer to all of these questions, is it wasn't what we did that mattered, although that mattered. It wasn't what we said that mattered, although that mattered. It was the nature of our character, what I would call our beingness, that made the British choose to leave India without a war. And the question, I think, for Americans is every day you make multiple small decisions. The toothpaste you buy, the cat food you buy, the toilet paper you buy, whatever. All these little bitty things that you do, every one of those is a vote. And you're either voting to foster well-being or not. And so your job is to find out which companies have policies which foster well-being and which policies don't. And it's not hard to do. You can do it. Before you do something, you can do a Google and find out which company is paying its workers a decent price, has good health care options, all that. It's all easily accessible on Google. And you, every day when you make these little decisions, you always choose of the options available to you at that moment, you always choose the one that you understand to be the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. And if you tell 10 people that you're doing it, and you invite them to do it and tell 10 of their friends, and I will tell you that of the people that are going to hear this interview, if they will do this, every decision, you always choose the one that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being, and you tell your friends you're doing it and invite them to join you. Just do the math. Of the people that are listening to this interview, if you do this, you can change the course of the 24 election and make it come out to be a life-affirming choice.
Stefan, what is it about our culture and our society that we don't have any serious intentions or even conversations around quality of life and well-being? Why is that not part of our societal dialogue?
Because starting with the Nixon administration, a group of wealthy people who understood what was happening in democracy began a strategy to alter the Republican, to alter the country, but they chose the Republican Party. And it really took off during Reagan. You know, I think the most symbolic thing about the Reagan administration is Jimmy Carter, who was the only president to ever fully understand what energy represents and how it works. He was a nuclear qualified engineer, a graduate of Annapolis, and he put solar panels on top of the White House. And I think the most symbolic thing about the Reagan administration is as soon as Ronald Reagan became president, he took them off. So if you think back to 1973 in the oil embargo, what would have happened if Jimmy Carter had been followed and had gotten a second term instead of being sabotaged, as we now understand, and we had gone on to begin the conversion away from the internal combustion engine. We had begun the conversion away from carbon energy, coal, power generation. We had given up on nuclear, which both Carter and Hyman Rickover, who created the nuclear navy, he testified. Rickover felt so strongly about this that as he was finally retiring and was this extraordinary, I mean, he created the nuclear navy, he asked to testify before Congress, and he testified and he said, don't do civil nuclear energy because we have no way to deal with the waste. And it goes on for thousands of years. Don't do it. And you also can't control it the way you can control it in a military setting. So don't do it. And Carter understood that and tried to do it, and then we completely reversed it. So as a result of that, and the result of the weaponization of the big thing about the internet is the weaponization of lies and the increasing misinformation and the weaponization of misinformation. So we don't talk about well-being. We tell ourselves, oh, it's the best country in the world. Everybody's the happiest. In fact, Finland is the happiest country in the world. We're not even close. We need to begin to I don't know if this part is possible. We need to form a unity of intention that as a country we are going to put into programs, policies, laws that foster well-being. I'm not sure that's going to happen at the national level, but I do think it's going to happen at the state level, because the blue states particularly are beginning to look at these things. I know in Washington, where I live, that the legislature, the governor, the governor's wife, understand that they have got to begin to lay track for what's coming, and they're trying to do that. I don't know what's going to happen to the red states, particularly the southern red states. As I say, if states like Mississippi and Louisiana were not in the United States, they'd be third world countries. So I think we're going to schism, but hold together as a single country. I would be much happier if everybody would get on board with this, but I'm not sure it's going to happen. And I think you just have to face that reality. What happens if it doesn't happen? And I think the answer is we're going to have these migrations. People are going to go to blue states. It's already happening. You can already see this happening. I don't see major change coming in the Republican Party. They have put into office people who are extraordinarily unqualified to be congresspeople, don't even understand what the role is, the job is about. I mean, I'm looking at this Jim Jordan investigation of the investigators' business. I mean, that's what they're wasting their time on, not what are we doing about the effects on healthcare that as a result of Dobbs. What are we doing about education? How are we, because Americans are getting more poorly educated. I found an 1895 graduating test for the 8th grade. It was given to 8th graders in a single-room schoolhouse in rural Kansas in 1895. And what I have discovered by asking Americans today to take it is that even college graduates can't pass this test. And if you think I'm kidding, go up on schwartzreport.net and the test is up there, and take the test and see if you can pass it. And this was a test, say again, for graduating 8th graders.
Stephen,
So
you're, I think what we're going to have to do is clone you and put you on every street corner in America. No, truthfully, when you say beingness, I find that the root of the problem is that beingness doesn't exist for many people. We're not operating from that wisdom of our hearts. We're not listening to the prompts that come our way. We're afraid of sacrifice. We're afraid of reorienting our world. I remember the first time I went into one of those places, Tom. What's the neighborhood in the community in Taos where there are all of the earth ships? You know.
Yeah, it's the Earthship community.
Yeah. So the first time I stayed in one of those overnight, I realized how damn unconscious I was about the use of power, the light, the water, and everything else. And yet, every one of us, not every one of us, the majority of us live in an environment in which we're about as conscious as a turnip or something, and they're probably more conscious than I know. You know, we just don't pay attention to what it takes to live, and yet we're going to move into a time where that understanding is going to mean the difference between living and dying. And still we resist it. So the only thing we can keep doing is bringing Stefan Schwartz on as many different programs as we can and letting him just tell the unvarnished truth about what we need to do in America. And I just want to celebrate you for doing it every damn day of your life, you know?
Well, thank you very much. Well, you know, I mean, what else is worth doing?
There isn't anything.
Well, I've got children and grandchildren, and I look at them. You know, I got a little 10-year-old grandson, and I look at him and I think, you know, by 2045, when he's an adult, for instance, what kind of world is he going to be living in? But you're right. I mean, if you look, for instance, at the obesity level, and then you look at the toxins that are in people's bodies, the microplastics, you know, I ask everybody that I talk to, are you recycling? Do you recycle everything? Do you eat organic food? Because it may be a little more expensive, but it's much cheaper than the illnesses that arise from filling your body with toxins. You know, why are we the richest country in the world, supposedly? Although the truth is, 4 people have as much wealth as the bottom 48%. But 1 in 7 children in the United States has food issues, to get enough food to eat. How is that possible? How can we not be feeding kids? And yet you look at what's going on, the Republican Party is trying to cut child food care. I mean, how do you do that? And the way we have to get past this is that a majority of us have got to make the commitment. We are going to do everything we can in all the little decisions we make to foster compassion, life-affirming fostering of well-being. I mean, it's just, you know, you say, well, you don't have any power, you don't have any position, you don't have any particular money or anything, but you do get to make these votes. The things you buy, the things you consume, what you do with your waste, all of those are simple little ordinary things. And by the choices that you make in those little simple things, you are affecting the kind of world we will have in the future. So it's up to you.
Yeah, maybe picking up on that, you mentioned 2045, that's 22 years away. We know, looking at the data, some pretty powerful information about what the world's going to look like by 2050. we've got about 80 million climate refugees on the planet right now. It's going to be as many as 1 billion by 2050. Can you walk us through just a little bit, paint that picture of what the world looks like in 30 years based on the data that we have and what we know right now?
I believe that between 2040 and 2045, there is going to be a massive, massive change in the culture of the country as a result of a variety of things which are occurring. By 2050, we may have as many as 50 to 80 million refugees in the United States. Some of the projections that I've looked at say by the end of the century we'll have 350 million refugees. That's virtually the entire population reorganizing itself. I don't know whether that's going to come to that level, but what is clear is that people who are along the coastlines, and that's millions of people, we're going to see, as a result of that, just along the coastlines, $1 trillion real estate collapse. So that's going to have a huge effect on the economy. We're going to see these internal migrations in Arizona. I mean, for instance, 7 states depend on the Colorado River for water, and it's already clear that there's just not enough water. So what that means is that, for instance, California, where much of the produce is grown, it's not going to be able to continue that way. So we need to begin planning what happens. How do we grow enough food in order to feed people? Because otherwise, the hunger issues are going to get much worse. It's doable. The question is, do we have the courage, the commitment to well-being necessary? And I don't see it happening from the top down. I think it has to happen from the bottom up. I mean, if you look at how things changed, I spent a great deal of time studying, for instance, how slavery ended and how women got the vote. And one of the things that really stood out for me was that the people who were engaged in it would say things in their diaries, which you could get and read. I don't know if slavery is going to end in my lifetime, but it is an evil, and I'm going to do everything I can for as long as I live to end it. Benjamin Franklin started out, he may have owned slaves, he certainly put slave selling ads in his newspapers, but he ended up as the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So you start with where you are, and the fact that you just think, well, I don't have any power, I don't have any money, they're not doing interviews with me or whatever. It doesn't matter. What matters is those little bitty choices. That's what Gandhi figured out and what he proved. And then Martin Luther King, who read Gandhi, modeled himself on that. And that's how we got to the 64 and 65 voting rights and the acts. Although I must say, I thought at that time, I heard Martin Luther King give the I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial, and I thought, well, we're finally coming to an end of this kind of racism, but actually I think it's worse today than it was then. And so again, it gets down to individual choices. It's got to come from the bottom up. And so all of us, what you all are doing, what I'm trying to do, what people we know are trying to do, we must get people to recognize that the little bitty choices they make actually are very big choices and can change the world.
Stefan, on that note, I'm going to leave people with your face and your countenance and the words that you've been speaking. I can't agree with you more. I know Tom does as well. And we're grateful for you spending this time with us, and I sincerely hope that every viewer of Humanity Rising gets to watch this again and again. And for every prod, eventually someplace, somebody grabs a tissue or does something and we wake up a little bit more. And I just thank you sincerely for the work that you do.
My pleasure. Happy to join with you.
Tom, any closing comment?
I so appreciate what you're up to in the world and your message of making choices in everything we buy, where we put the things that we no longer want or need. It does literally come down to that, as well as where do we invest our money? Who do we invest it with? But those conscious choices, it's that simple and it's that hard.
Stefan, blessings, and thank you for your time with us, really. Thank you very, very much.
Happy to join you.
Jim, are you here? I just have a few moments, but some thoughts, please. You've heard Tom and I's perspective and Stefan's for sure.
Well, I've known Stefan for many decades now, going back to the citizen diplomacy days in the 80s and 90s, in which we both participated and interacted and were in Moscow together and traveled around. So I've always admired his piercing intellect and his Renaissance capacity to bring very diverse areas of, the human endeavors together synthetically, and also with a commitment to social change. I hadn't been in touch with him for some time, so it was a delight for me to watch this video. I've been sitting here, both enthralled at what he's saying, because I think, as you both indicated, he's really laying it out unvarnished. And sometimes that's just really important. I think there's occasions when you want to be optimistic, but there's also occasions, as Gorbachev used to say, when you need to be ruthlessly realistic. And I think that's what Stephen is laying out. I think I would underscore two things that he said, which I think are really important for those of us at Humanity Rising. When he talks about the individual responsibility for change, referring to Gandhi's reply to the journalist from the Times of India, it's not so much what they did, it's how they did it. And, when we do the coherence breathing, for example, or you do mindfulness, you don't really change what you do as much as you change who's doing it. And I think that's a very important truth for us in a collapsing world and in a collapsing country, that we now have an urgent personal responsibility to enable ourselves to be as authentically transformational, compassionate, caring as we possibly can be, because what we're now all going to be navigating through is going to tax us at levels that we can't even imagine. And I pointed out a couple of days ago this study, which Stefan probably knows about, but is worth repeating, that according to the Pentagon, 77% of all the people who volunteered to join the U.S. military are judged to be unqualified, either because of gross obesity or chronic drug use or mental issues. so that this campaign on the part of the right wing to dumb us down and limit our opportunities and so forth is having a real effect. And we need to counter that with a real clarity that, my God, as Ken Wilber says, we have to wake up and grow up and show up in really unprecedented ways. So that'd be one thing that I would say. The other comment that I would make is I think he accentuated, the code red issues that we are dealing with in Humanity Rising. I mean, as you put it in your last program on climate change, Tom, is that climate change isn't the right word anymore. We got to talk about climate disaster, and that this climate disaster is having an escalating effect in terms of migration, in terms of cost of the economy. That guy's question who didn't believe in climate change, how many times should we rebuild a town, is what's coming up all over the world as the escalation continues. And, when you have one cyclone in East Africa, that's the equivalent to a whole hurricane season in North America, you get some measure of the crisis in front of us. But that, just to state in conclusion, what he said about the 2024 election. We need to understand, and you brought it up many times, George, that this started really in the Nixon administration, a concerted strategic campaign that has led the United States to where it is today. And if they can seize one or both houses and the presidency in 2024, it's essentially game over for democracy as we know it, or we've imagined it with all its foibles and, warts and all, as they say. And we need to pay attention to that and come together at an unprecedented level. So I think Stefan was right on. I think we can take confidence, everyone, that we're paying attention to these issues, and we're trying to deal with them as we can on the programs that we're offering day by day.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I just, the reason we asked the question that we ask today and almost every day on different topics on Humanity Rising is, are we going to wake up? And the waking up doesn't require us to, run out in front of the army and charge the barricades and all of that. It's again and again, people that know what they're doing, whether they're talking about climate or democracy or poverty or childhood education or whatever it is, they know that each of us has the capacity and the opportunity every day to do our little part of that. To, in our own lives, pay attention to that beingness that we've been talking about and that happens every day when we do the heart-head coherence and breathing. We have so many choices that we can make. And the question is, are we showing up in that way? Not everybody's going to be in Congress or the Supreme Court or run for president or whatnot, but each of us is a sovereign in our own lives, and we have that opportunity. So my only request to myself every day, because I see where I stumble, I see where I go to sleep, where I miss opportunities to be more conscious, more awake, more committed. I think if each of us just keeps asking those questions honestly within ourselves, can I do more today to help preserve humanity, the other species, this planet? I think we can make a better world. As a cliche we've talked about, the Chinese say that if everybody sweeps in front of their own house, eventually the whole street gets clean. So how much sweeping are we doing today? And that's what our goal is on Humanity Rising. It's to help us by bringing people like Stefan and others to the fore who speak their truth and are provocative and prompt us to use our hearts, to use our imaginations, to make a difference. Because if we don't, as St. Augustine said, you know, he who created us without our help will not save us without our consent. And our consent is our doing, our commitment, and our being. So I do have to leave early. Tom and Jim may want to talk more today, but I just want to tell you tomorrow, John Steiner, who's been a really incredible collaborator in this whole Democracy Dialogue series, will be back on. He's been recuperating in Hawaii from some surgery, and he'll be hosting the show tomorrow with Jim. And we have three remarkable guests. Richard Cisnik, who is a reformed evangelical who speaks the truth about that side of the coin and what we can do. Jim Ollis and Barbara Skinner, who have a remarkable organization that brings together people of faith to make a difference in our world. So I hope you tune in. And Jim, Tom, thanks for letting me slip away to a doctor's appointment myself. And
Healthcare is important.
Yeah. Blessings.
Go well. Bye.
Thank you, George.
Do you have any comment that you'd like to make?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I really appreciated Stefan really focusing on well-being. That's the ultimate metric that we should be using as a society and as a species. And for whatever reason, we've lost our way in using that as a metric, and it's been replaced by, at the national level, GDP. It's been replaced by economic metrics instead of well-being. It's not that the economics don't contribute to well-being, but they should be and necessarily have to be subservient to well-being and in service of well-being. So that would be one point. The second point I would make is something I suspect I've shared before on other broadcasts, is that the hardest people to wake are those who are pretending to be asleep. And each of us in our own way, we have the information. We know what the right things are to do, and yet we continue to make the bad choices. And so each of us, when we're finding those moments that we're pretending to be asleep, is the time when we have to wake up. And that is the vast majority of the world, I suspect, are pretending to be asleep and just choosing not to do the right things.
Yeah. Well, I just, as I've been thinking about it, I'd make two other comments as well. One is, I think there's a pretty straight line between the doctrine of discovery and Christofascism. And the hold of the Christo-fascists on the Republican Party. You know, what the Pope gave to the European powers was essentially carte blanche, total permission to do anything they wanted. And now 500 years later, the indigenous have risen up, like in India, overthrown the colonials. The people of color have received the franchise. And so there's this huge transformation of demographics, of value, and the people who have been used to governing without question for so long are doing everything they can to stem the tide of history and are willing to destroy the world rather than give up their prerogatives. And so as that thought came to me, Tom, when you made the comment in the interview of, these guys are like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And that's the extraordinary thing, that they're willing to destroy the village in order to save it, as they said in Vietnam. And we need to understand that. And that's why the announcement today by the Vatican is symbolically and in terms of archetypal function in the collective psyche and an amazingly important statement that we can all take comfort in, even though it didn't go the whole way, as these events almost never do. It nevertheless punctured the divine sanction and providential permission that the Europeans, the Christians, have enjoyed as they've implemented fascism around the world in a highly racist, coercive way. So I think making that connection, I think, is important. And then the other comment that I would make is about Humanity Rising Network. You know, if we're in a world where there's a strategic intent on the part of a major power group to erode education and the capacity of citizens to make aware choices, one of the most important things that we can do, which is at the heart of Humanity Rising Network, is to bring the cutting edge content into a global distribution system. Because if the governments aren't going to deal with climate change, the people have got to become aware and do what they can. And if the institution of education is being systematically eviscerated, then we, the people, through organizations like Humanity Rising and Humanity Rising Network, need to do everything we can to make sure that the Stefan Schwartzes of the world are getting out there so people have the benefit of the kind of education through HRN they should be getting in school. You know, we wouldn't be here if we were being educated properly. So I just want to acknowledge everyone that what we're doing at Humanity Rising as we evolve it into Humanity Rising Network, and the possibility of building multiple channels that will allow content providers in the NGO community and frontline organizations on code red issues to have a capacity to broadcast globally what they're doing in a way that empowers people toward the well-being, Tom, that you just spoke about and Stefan spoke about, and we try to do every day with our coherence, breathing, etc., is an urgent imperative for humanity if it's going to rise at all. So those would be the comments that I would add to this discussion. This has been a really fertile program today. So thank you, Tom. Wonderful as always. And everyone, you're welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link that Stan just put in the chat box. And then we'll see everyone tomorrow for the fourth and final session of Democracy and Governance that will be looking at what the religious sector in the face of Christo-fascism can do to revitalize the citizenry, but also revitalize the very evangelical communities that are the source of so much of this problem. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Jim.